Have you ever had a belief destroyed? Not shaken, not questioned. Destroyed, taken apart piece by piece, until in the place where there was once a solid certainty, only the wind and the vertigo of realizing that you had built your life on something that was never as firm as it seemed remained. If you have, you know that this experience has two phases. The first is panic. The ground disappears. The walls vanish. Everything you used as a reference to know who you were and where you were and what mattered simply stops working, and you find yourself there, suspended in the middle of nowhere, not knowing where to look. The second phase, if you have the courage to get through the first without running to the first certainty that appears to replace the one you lost, is different. It is silence, but not the empty silence, the full silence. The silence of someone who, for the first time, can hear what has always been there beneath the noise. Baruch Spinoza lived entirely in the second phase, and what he heard in that silence changed the world. There is a book that the European governments of the 17th century placed on a list called prohibited books. It was not a manual of political sedition. It was not pornography. It was not a treatise teaching techniques of poisoning or instructions for building weapons. It was a book of philosophy, written with the cold and methodical structure of a mathematics book, definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, about the oldest themes that exist: God, the mind, emotions, freedom, death. The religious authorities read the first pages and understood before finishing that it was more dangerous than any revolutionary pamphlet, because pamphlets ask you to change sides. This book asked something different. It asked you to change your eyes. And once you change your eyes, there is no going back. The book was called Ethics. The author was Baruch Spinoza. And the central idea, the idea that made the world collapse around him, that cost him family, community, security, acceptance, everything, could fit in a single sentence. God and nature are the same thing. 4 words in the original Latin: Deus sive natura, God or nature, as if they were interchangeable. As if the distinction that every religion had placed between the creator and the creation, the sacred distance between the divine up there and the material down here, was an illusion, a useful fiction perhaps, but a fiction. When you understand what this sentence really means, not the superficial version, not the 2-minute summary, but the full weight of what Spinoza was asserting, you will understand why Einstein, when looking at the equations that described the structure of the universe, responded to a rabbi who asked him about God with just 5 words: "I believe in the God of Spinoza." But before we get to the ideas, I need to tell you about the man, because Spinoza was not an academic protected by university walls. He was not a noble with lands and a title who could afford to think freely, because money created enough distance between him and the consequences. He was the son of a merchant, an orphan at 6 years old. He grew up in a community of Sephardic Jews who had fled the Portuguese Inquisition, who carried in their bodies and memories what happens when an empire decides that your faith is wrong and that you have to choose between changing or dying. These people knew the price of thinking differently, and yet Spinoza thought differently, not out of naivety, not because he didn't know the price, but because there was something in him that simply could not function any other way. A kind of allergy to intellectual lies, a physical, almost physiological inability to accept a statement that did not hold up when examined honestly. He was the kind of person who, when someone said, "God did this because he wanted," would pause for a second and then ask with that disconcerting calm, "But what does it mean to want?" for a being who already has everything and knows everything in advance. And when the person responded with a verse, he would fall silent again and ask, "Who wrote that verse?" A human being, right? With a specific language, in a specific culture, at a specific historical moment. How do we know that what he wrote is different from what any other human being wrote when trying to describe the indescribable? Can you imagine the effect that this kind of question had in a room full of people who based their entire identity, their entire survival as a community, on certainties that could not be questioned? The day this exploded was July 27th, 1656. Spinoza was 23 years old. The document of excommunication that was read that night still exists. You can find it in historical archives in Amsterdam. And when you read it, when you read the intensity of the language, the violence of the curses, the determination to erase not just the man but any trace of the contagion he represented, you realize that those religious leaders were afraid, very afraid, not of Spinoza. They could handle Spinoza with a decree. They were afraid of the questions, because questions, real, honest questions that do not accept because it is written as an answer, are the only thing that a system based on authority cannot control. You can burn books. You cannot burn the human capacity to ask. Spinoza left the synagogue that night, crossed the streets of Amsterdam with the smell of the canal in the air, and the curse still echoing behind him, and went to an empty room. He rented more rooms over the years. He learned to polish glass lenses, the artisanal work that paid his bills and that, ironically, was destroying his lungs while he wrote about eternity. He declined a university chair that would have given him financial security because reading the conditions of the position and realizing that there would be restrictions on what he could publish was enough for him to decline without hesitation. He refused a pension from a prince. He refused fame. He refused comfort, not out of religious asceticism, not because he thought suffering was noble, because he had understood, and this is one of the most beautiful and difficult things he wrote, that freedom is not having what you want. It is not being a slave to what you want. It is understanding your own desires deeply enough to know which of them are yours and which have been placed in you by others, and choosing with open eyes which ones are worth pursuing. He followed the truth, and he paid the price, and he did not regret it. There is not a single record, a single letter, a single line in his writings that suggests regret. In the next few hours, you will enter this world, not from the outside, from the inside. We will start in the streets of Amsterdam in the 17th century, in a community that had survived the impossible and was trying to rebuild what the Inquisition had destroyed. We will understand the boy before understanding the philosopher. We will smell the environment before entering the ideas. And then we will enter the ideas, what Spinoza meant by God, why this is different from everything any religion has said, why it is also different from simple atheism, why Einstein recognized him in the structure of the cosmos, why Freud recognized him in the structure of the mind, why contemporary neuroscience researchers keep stumbling upon him while studying consciousness, why you, now here, with everything you know and everything you doubt, will recognize him somewhere you still cannot name. I will ask you just one thing during this journey. Do not agree. Do not disagree. Do not judge before understanding. Just listen. With the same quality of attention that Spinoza used when he heard a statement, rolling it around, examining it, following each thread to the end, before deciding what to do with it. If you can do this for a few hours, what happens on the other side is not my responsibility to describe, because it is different for each person. But I do not know anyone who has reached the end of Spinoza and left the same way they entered. No one. So, Amsterdam, 1632. A boy is born on a narrow street, the child of refugees who carry too much history in their bones. This is where we begin. To understand Baruch Spinoza, you first need to understand the smell of Amsterdam in the winter of 1632. It is not a metaphor, it is literal. The city smelled of salted fish, wet wood, oriental spice, and canal sewage. It was a mixture that the residents had stopped noticing, but that attacked newcomers with an almost physical force. A constant reminder that this city was, above all, a city of commerce. A city that had been built not on granite or on faith, but on the pragmatic and revolutionary idea that money has no religion, that goods have no soul, and that a man who knows how to negotiate is more valuable to the community than a man who knows how to pray. This idea, banal to us, explosive for the 17th century, made Amsterdam a unique place in the Western world. While the rest of Europe continued to burn heretics, expel minorities, and build walls between the different versions of the same God, Amsterdam was doing the math. And the math showed that tolerance was good for business, that a city where Jews, Protestants, Catholics, Anabaptists, and Mennonites could coexist without killing each other was a city where trade flowed, where talents from all over converged, where ideas mixed and produced innovation. It was not tolerance for principle's sake, it was tolerance for profit. But it worked. And it was to this city, to this improbable experiment of coexistence driven by greed, but that ended up producing something akin to freedom, that hundreds of Jewish families from the Iberian Peninsula arrived over the decades leading up to Spinoza's birth. They had a name. They were called Sephardim, from the Hebrew Sepharad, which is how they referred to Spain. And they carried with them a history that no book can fully convey, because it is the kind of history that is only transmitted in the body, in the reflections, in the instinct to lower one's voice in public, in the habit of not accumulating too many objects, because too many objects mean you cannot escape quickly. In 1492, the same year Columbus arrived on the continent that would become known as America, in a historical coincidence that seems invented, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain signed the Alhambra Decree. The decree ordered that all Jews in Spain convert to Catholicism or leave the country within 4 months. Historical estimates speak of 150,000 people forced into exile. Some went to North Africa, some to the Ottoman Empire, some to Italy. Many went to Portugal, a neighbor, seemingly more tolerant, where they thought they would be safe. They were not. 5 years later, Portugal forced the mass conversion of all Jews who had entered. They baptized children by force. They separated families. They created the figure of the new Christian, the convert of whom no one truly believed in the conversion, who would continue to be watched, suspected, investigated by the Inquisition for generations. The families that publicly converted and continued practicing Judaism in secret, within their homes, with the windows closed and the doors locked, became known as Marranos, a word that in Portuguese means pig, and that was used as an insult, but that these families transformed over time into something akin to an identity. Baruch Spinoza's family was one of those families. The paternal grandfather, Isaac de Spinoza, had lived in Portugal as a new Christian. The Inquisition had knocked on his door more than once. The pressure was constant, the surveillance, the distrust, the danger of being denounced by a neighbor, a colleague, even a family member who had genuinely converted and looked at relatives with the same suspicion with which the priest looked at them. At some point in the early 17th century, the family decided to leave. They arrived in Amsterdam. They opened a business. They started life anew. And they did something they could only do in a city like that. They became Jews openly again, with a Hebrew name, with a synagogue, with the rituals they had practiced in secret for decades, now performed without fear, with the windows open, with the Sabbath candles lit for anyone to see. Baruch's father, Michael de Spinoza, was a merchant of imported fruits, mainly dried fruits and spices that came from trade routes passing through the Mediterranean. He was a respected man in the community. He paid his taxes, fulfilled his community obligations, educated his children according to tradition. Baruch was born in November 1632. The name means blessed in Hebrew. In Portuguese, the translation would be Bento, and indeed in some historical documents, he appears as Benedito de Spinoza or Bento de Espinosa. But the world knows him as Baruch, and later as the Latinized name he would adopt, Benedictus de Spinoza. There were children in the house, an older sister, Miriam, a younger brother, Gabriel, a mother, Hannah, who died when Baruch was 6 years old, of tuberculosis, the disease that at that time claimed lives with the indifference of a wheat harvest. The father remarried Esther, who would also die relatively young, and then again with Rebecca. Death was a familiar presence in Baruch de Spinoza's childhood, as it was for almost everyone in the 17th century, but especially for the children of refugees who carried in their genetic code the memory of the awareness that life is precarious, that what seems solid can disappear overnight, that the only thing no one can take from you is what you carry inside your head. Perhaps this explains something about why he thought what he thought. The heart of the Jewish community in Amsterdam was not the market, although the market was important. It was the Talmud Torah, the school where boys were educated early in the sacred texts, in the Hebrew language, in Jewish law, in the history of the people. Baruch entered the Talmud Torah around the age of 6 or 7. The curriculum was rigorous and followed a clear progression. It began with the Hebrew alphabet and the reading of the Torah. It advanced to the Talmud, with its intricate rabbinical debates on law and ethics. Then medieval Jewish philosophy, Maimonides above all, the great Rambam, who had tried in the 12th century to do what Spinoza would attempt in the 17th, reconcile philosophical reason with religious faith, Aristotle with Moses. The boy was good, very good. Not in the sense that he memorized easily, although he did. He was good in the more valuable and rare sense he understood. He took a text that the other students deciphered word by word and saw the structure behind the words, the argument behind the story, the question behind the answer. And then he would ask another question. The older teachers recognized this kind of intelligence. They knew it was a gift. They also knew it was complicated, because a mind that sees the question behind the answer does not stop asking at the convenient moment. It does not respect the invisible line that separates the permitted questions from the dangerous questions. There are records that Baruch was the kind of student who made the masters feel a discomfort they could not quite name. It was not insolence. It was something more disconcerting than insolence. It was a quality of attention that made it impossible to respond vaguely. That demanded that each assertion be exactly what it claimed to be, not approximately, not poetically, not in the spirit of the thing, exactly, with precision. With the gentle cruelty of someone who loves the truth more than they love the comfort of those around them. The intellectual context in which Spinoza grew up was richer and more tense than the simple image of a religious community closed in on itself. 17th century Amsterdam was one of the most intellectually vibrant cities in Europe. It was where Descartes had published some of his works. The French philosopher, who proposed the idea that reason, not authority, should be the foundation of knowledge. It was where news of the scientific revolution that had begun with Copernicus and passed through Galileo circulated, and which was, at the time of Spinoza's birth, being consolidated by the work of a young Englishman named Isaac Newton. The world was changing, not visibly in the daily lives of ordinary people. The streets of Amsterdam in 1640 did not seem much different from the streets of 1580. But in the minds of those who were paying attention, a rupture was happening. A rupture that had to do with a fundamental question: where does knowledge come from? For centuries the answer had been clear. From authority, from scripture, from tradition, from what the elders said, from what the sacred texts affirmed, from what the church or the synagogue or the mosque confirmed. The scientific revolution said otherwise. It said that knowledge comes from observation and reason, that you do not discover how the planets move by reading Aristotle. You discover by looking at the sky, measuring, calculating, and accepting the result, even when it contradicts what is written. This idea, seemingly simple, profoundly explosive, was in the air that Baruch Spinoza breathed throughout his education. It was in the books he read beyond the official curriculum. It was in conversations with men like Franciscus van den Enden, a Latin teacher and free thinker whom Spinoza met in his young adult years and who systematically exposed him to Cartesian thought, Greco-Roman philosophy, and the political ideas that were fermenting throughout Europe. It was also in the texts of heterodox Jewish philosophers that the community knew but preferred not to discuss. Loud voice. Men like Uriel da Costa, who had arrived in Amsterdam decades earlier full of hope, only to discover that the real Judaism of the synagogue did not match the idealized Judaism he had imagined from years of reading the Bible during his life as a new Christian in Portugal. He had questioned the immortality of the soul and the divine origin of the oral law. He had been excommunicated, publicly humiliated, forced into a degrading retraction before the entire congregation, and had committed suicide shortly thereafter. Uriel da Costa's story was known to everyone in the community. It was, among other things, a warning. Baruch heard the warning and thought the same way. Spinoza's world was, therefore, a world of tensions between the tradition that had formed him and the reason that was beginning to question the foundations of that tradition, between loyalty to the community that had survived persecution and the intellectual honesty that could not pretend that certain questions did not exist, between the love for the texts he had studied since childhood and the growing realization that these texts were human documents, historical, cultural, limited, and not the literal word of an eternal God. There was no way to resolve this tension comfortably. It was a tension that demanded a choice, And Baruch Spinoza, still young, still trying to understand what was forming within him, still living in his father's house and working in the family business, after Michael de Spinoza fell ill, kept postponing that choice. But questions do not postpone. Questions wait, with the relentless patience of everything that is true. There is a type of thought that you do not choose to have. It simply appears, in the middle of a prayer, in the pause between one phrase and another of a sacred text, in the silence after the teacher finishes explaining, and asks if there are any doubts, and you feel the doubt forming within you with the inevitability of a wave that was far away, that you saw coming from afar, that you waited for and that arrived anyway. Baruch Spinoza had this type of thought since he could remember. They were not thoughts of rebellion. He did not possess that kind of teenager who wants to shock adults, who questions for the sake of questioning, who finds pleasure in provocation. Spinoza's pleasure was different. It was the pleasure of understanding, of getting to the bottom of something, of not leaving a problem until the problem was completely dismantled, each piece examined, each hidden assumption brought to the surface and evaluated in the light of reason. This pleasure, pure, disinterested, almost physical in its intensity, was the engine. The problem is that when you apply this engine to sacred texts, you arrive at places that the sacred texts were not built to go. Let us take, for example, the question of creation. The first verse of the Torah says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Generations of commentators had spent centuries discussing the meaning of each word in that phrase. What does beginning mean? What was God doing before the beginning? Did God create from nothing, from what existed before nothing, from himself? The answers varied, but almost all commentators reached a point where they stopped and said, here is where human reason meets its limit. Creation is a mystery that transcends human understanding. Accept it by faith. Spinoza read these answers with that particular attention that made teachers uncomfortable. And then he asked, for himself, for now. But why would the limit be precisely here? Who decided that reason goes up to this point and no further? And was that decision made because there really is a limit, or because what lies beyond the limit is inconvenient? Because what lies beyond the limit, when you cross it, is a very specific question. If God created the universe, what was there before the universe? And if the answer is nothing, what is nothing? Nothing has no properties, right? It has no dimension, no duration, no structure. How did nothing generate something? How did an absolute absence become a presence? And if the answer is God was there before, then something existed before the universe. Then God exists outside the universe. Then there is God on one side and the universe on the other. But if God is infinite, how can anything exist outside of God? The infinite, by definition, cannot have an outside. If it has an outside, it is not infinite. And if God is infinite and the universe exists within God, then the universe is part of God. Then the stone in the path is part of God. The water in the canal is part of God. The thought you are having right now is part of God. The pain, the pleasure, the mistake, the rightness, all part of God. And if everything is part of God, in what sense did God create anything? A being does not create itself. The waves were not created by the ocean, they are the ocean in motion. So the universe was not created by God, it is God in motion. Deus sive natura, God or nature. This reasoning, which Spinoza would come to formulate with mathematical precision decades later in the Ethics, did not suddenly arise one enlightening afternoon. It grew over years, question by question, brick by brick, with the patience of someone who knows they are building something that will last. While this internal edifice grew, external life continued. Spinoza's father, Michael, had fallen ill in recent years. The fruit import business was facing difficulties, debts, commercial disputes, the inherent instability of trade at a time when a storm in the Mediterranean could swallow an entire shipment and ruin months of planning. Baruch took on responsibilities. He was the eldest son. There was a family to support, a business to maintain, obligations to the community that could not be ignored without social consequences. He did all of this, competently, seriously, and in the intervals, in the hours between closing the warehouse and sleep, in the mornings before work began, he read. Everything that came to his hands, Latin, which he had learned from Van den Enden, Spanish, which was the language of the Sephardic community, Portuguese, which the elders still used among themselves, and the Hebrew of the sacred texts, which had been the first language of his thought. What he read formed layers, Descartes underneath, Maimonides on top, Hobbes on one shelf, Bacon on another, and the Hebrew texts of the tradition, the Torah, the Talmud, the Kabbalah, with its mystical speculations about the nature of God, now read with eyes that had been trained by rational philosophy to ask, but what does this mean? Not poetically, not spiritually. What does it actually mean? He began to share these questions, carefully at first, with close friends, in conversations that were exploratory, provisional, the kind you have when you are thinking out loud and not necessarily defending a position, with men who frequented similar intellectual circles, who read the same books, who asked the same questions even though they did not always arrive at the same answers. But the questions grew. They became more specific, more consequential, and they began to leak out. The questions that leaked out were serious in the sense that they had direct theological consequences that any educated rabbi would immediately recognize. The first was the Torah written by Moses, or was it written by multiple authors, in multiple historical periods, and retrospectively attributed to Moses by tradition? This question may seem academic now. In the 17th century, it was explosive, because if the Torah was written by human beings, with their limited perspectives, their cultural biases, their political and social goals, then it is not the literal word of God. It is the word of human beings about God, which is a completely different thing. Spinoza had noticed things in the text that tradition explained in increasingly elaborate ways, but which, for a mind trained in rational analysis, had a simpler explanation. The book of Deuteronomy, which supposedly Moses dictated, describes Moses' death. How did Moses write about his own death? Tradition said. It was prophecy. Spinoza said, or it was written by someone after Moses' death. The second question, is the soul immortal? The Bible, examined carefully, does not clearly state what popular tradition says about the afterlife. The concept of an immortal soul that goes to heaven or hell, that concept has much more of a Greek than a Hebrew origin. Plato had formulated this idea centuries earlier, and it had entered Jewish and Christian theology so gradually that many had forgotten it was not there from the beginning. The third, does God have emotions? Does he have preferences? Does he love one people more than another? Spinoza had arrived through this path to where it is fundamentally opposed to one's own beliefs, is a hallmark of Spinoza's philosophical approach. He recognized that the community's actions were driven by their own fears and the need to protect their identity in a world that was often hostile to them. This understanding did not soften the blow of his excommunication, but it did allow him to maintain a certain distance from the emotional turmoil that might have consumed someone else in his position. As he moved away from Amsterdam, Spinoza began to carve out a new life for himself, one that was defined not by the community that had cast him out, but by his own intellectual pursuits. He took refuge in the study of philosophy, mathematics, and science, immersing himself in the works of thinkers who had come before him, while also developing his own ideas. The solitude that followed his excommunication became a fertile ground for his thoughts, allowing him to explore concepts of existence, substance, and the nature of God without the constraints of communal expectations. In the years that followed, Spinoza's writings began to take shape. He wrote the Principles of Cartesian Philosophy, which showcased his mathematical approach to philosophy, and later, Ethics, a monumental work that would cement his legacy as one of the most important philosophers in Western thought. In Ethics, he articulated his vision of God as synonymous with nature, challenging the anthropomorphic views of divinity that had dominated religious thought. His ideas about the interconnectedness of all things and the necessity of understanding the universe through reason rather than faith were revolutionary. Despite his growing reputation as a philosopher, Spinoza remained largely isolated from the Jewish community. He did not seek to return to the fold, nor did he attempt to reconcile his beliefs with those of his former community. Instead, he embraced his status as an outsider, finding solace in the pursuit of knowledge and the freedom that came with it. His life became a testament to the power of intellectual integrity and the importance of living authentically, even in the face of societal rejection. Spinoza's legacy is not just in his philosophical contributions, but also in the example he set for future generations. He demonstrated that the quest for truth often requires sacrifice, and that the courage to stand by one's convictions can lead to profound insights and understanding. His life and work continue to inspire those who seek to navigate the complexities of belief, identity, and the pursuit of knowledge in a world that often demands conformity. In conclusion, Baruch Spinoza's journey from a young man grappling with existential questions to a foundational figure in modern philosophy illustrates the transformative power of intellectual inquiry. His excommunication from the Jewish community was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a catalyst for his philosophical development. By choosing to prioritize his quest for truth over communal acceptance, Spinoza not only forged a new path for himself, but also laid the groundwork for future thinkers who would follow in his footsteps. His life serves as a reminder of the importance of intellectual freedom and the enduring impact of ideas that challenge the status quo. You consider it wrong not to confuse the position with the person who occupies it. This ability is one of the most consistent and admirable traits of his entire life and work. It was during this period, in the months and years immediately following the excommunication, that Spinoza began to write systematically. Not the grand project yet. The Ethics would take 20 years to be completed, but smaller, exploratory texts that circulated among trusted friends in handwritten copies, a brief treatise on God, the human mind, and human well-being, commentaries on Descartes, correspondence with philosophers and scientists from all over Europe, who had discovered him through informal networks of intellectuals that existed in that century, as salons existed in the following one. Spaces for free conversation, where ideas prohibited in official publications could be discussed among people who trusted each other. Spinoza's reputation grew in these circles in a way that seems paradoxical. He was more famous among European intellectuals than among the general public, and this fame grew precisely because of the ideas that had led to his expulsion. Because for the men who thought about the same problems he did, how to reconcile reason with faith, how to understand the nature of the mind, how to think about God in a way that would withstand the scrutiny of logic, Spinoza represented something that had been lacking until then, someone who had gone all the way, without stopping, without retreating, without wrapping the conclusions in sacred language to make them palatable. Someone who had paid the price of going all the way and had survived and continued to think, and had come out the other side with a system that stood firm. The system that was forming had a foundation, a cornerstone from which everything else would necessarily derive. And this cornerstone was a definition, not a statement, not an article of faith, a definition in the precise philosophical sense of the word, a declaration of what a thing is, formulated in such a way that, if you accept the terms, everything that follows from it follows necessarily. The definition was about God. Spinoza wrote, "By God I understand a being absolutely infinite, that is, a substance that consists of infinite attributes, each of which expresses an eternal and infinite essence." Substance, attributes, eternal and infinite essence. Words that seem technical, but that, when you unfold them carefully, reveal something of a radicality that the first reading does not capture. Because Spinoza is saying, there is one thing, a single thing, that is absolutely infinite. This means that there is nothing that is not part of it. There cannot be. Because if there were something outside of it, it would not be infinite. And if there is a single thing that is absolutely infinite, and everything that exists is part of that thing, then what we call the universe and what we call God are the same thing, viewed from different angles. God sive natura, God or nature. The most explosive phrase in Western philosophy of the last 500 years. It fits on a page. It would change everything. Think of the simplest thing that exists, a stone. a common stone, the kind you kick without thinking on the sidewalk and that remains there after you pass, indifferent, silent, existing with that mute obstinacy of things that have no choice but to exist. Now think of God, whatever image you have, a being of light, an infinite presence, a cosmic consciousness, an invisible architect. Hold that image in your mind. The question Spinoza posed was this: what separates these two things? The traditional answer is obvious: everything. The stone is matter, finite, without consciousness, without purpose. God is spirit, infinite, conscious, the source of all purpose. The stone is creature, God is creator. The stone came into existence at a specific moment and will cease to exist eventually, when erosion dissolves it into sand. God is eternal, without beginning and without end. Spinoza looked at this answer and saw a problem. Not a small problem, a fundamental problem. A problem that once seen cannot be unseen. The problem is this: if God is infinite, truly, absolutely infinite, how can there be something that is not God? The stone exists. You exist, I exist, the universe exists. If it exists, it must be somewhere. And if God is infinite, it occupies all possible space, literally all space, every mode of being, every form of existence. Then the stone cannot be outside of God. There is no outside. There is no outside of a truly infinite being. The stone must be within God. It must be part of God. It must be in some way an expression of God. And if the stone is an expression of God, and the tree is an expression of God, and you and I and the sky and the vacuum of space and the law of gravity and time and space and thought, if all of this is an expression of God, then what we are calling the universe is simply God expressing itself. And God and the universe are not two different things with a relationship between them. They are the same thing, God sive natura. The Latin word that Spinoza uses to describe this is substantia, substance. And here we need to pause for a moment to understand what he means by substance, because it is not what you probably think. In everyday use, substance means matter, the material of which things are made. But in philosophy, especially in the tradition that comes from Aristotle and passes through the medieval scholastics, substance has a more technical sense. It means that which exists by itself, in itself, without needing anything else to exist. A chair is not substance in this sense. It exists by virtue of the wood it is made of, the shape it has been given, the space it occupies. It depends on other things to be what it is. You are not substance in this sense either. You exist by virtue of a body that depends on food, air, appropriate temperature, a planet at the right distance from the sun, a billion-year evolutionary history. You depend on all of this to be what you are. What would be substance in the true sense? What would exist completely by itself that would not depend on anything outside itself to be what it is? Spinoza's answer is only one thing: God, or nature, or God, or nature. The unique, infinite, eternal substance that exists by itself and of which everything else is an expression. But here an objection arises that any attentive reader will formulate. Descartes, the philosopher who most influenced Spinoza, and with whom Spinoza constantly dialogued even when he disagreed, had proposed a different solution. For Descartes, there were two substances: mind, res cogitans, the thing that thinks, and matter, res extensa, the thing that extends in space. God had created both, and they were fundamentally different. This solution has a problem that Descartes never satisfactorily resolved, and that he knew he had not resolved. If mind and matter are completely different substances, if thought is of a totally different nature than physical matter, how do they interact? When you decide to raise your arm, a thought, immaterial substance, without location in space, somehow causes a physical movement, material substance, totally different. How? Through what channel? By what mechanism? Descartes answered, and this is one of the most famous and most uncomfortable answers in the history of philosophy, that the interaction happened in the pineal gland, a small structure in the center of the brain. The answer was obviously unsatisfactory, and Descartes knew, but he had no other. Spinoza did. Spinoza's answer was that the separation does not exist, that mind and matter are not two different substances. They are two attributes of the same substance, two angles from which you can describe the same reality. Thought and extension do not interact, because they are not two separate things that need to touch. They are the same thing described in two different vocabularies. Just as water and H2O do not interact, they are the same thing described in one language and in a chemical language. This resolves Descartes' mind-body problem in a way that is elegant enough to provoke vertigo, and places Spinoza, at this specific point, 300 years ahead of debates that still occupy philosophers and neuroscientists today. The attributes of God. Spinoza says that the unique substance has infinite attributes, but we, as human beings, only have access to two, thought and extension. Thought is the attribute by which God, or nature, expresses itself as mind, as consciousness, as idea. Extension is the attribute by which God, or nature, expresses itself. Critical. Translate all 1,500 words of this text. Do not omit anything, as matter, as body, as something that occupies space. And everything that exists, every thought you have, every object you can touch, every emotion you feel, every law of physics that governs the movement of the planets is a mode of one of these attributes. Modes, not separate creations, not objects that God made and then placed in the universe like a carpenter who makes a chair and puts it in a room. Modes in the sense of forms in which substance manifests itself, forms in which God exists. The waves are modes of the ocean. They were not created by the ocean. They are the ocean in motion. When the wave passes, the ocean has lost nothing. There is no wave without the ocean. There is no ocean without the possibility of waves. You are a mode of God or nature, not a separate creature made by an external craftsman, placed in a universe that you observe from the outside. A form through which the universe, God, expresses itself at this specific moment, in this specific configuration, with this particular thought and this particular body. Now you can understand why this was unacceptable to the religious authorities. It was not simply atheism. That would have been easier to deal with. Atheism denies God. Spinoza did not deny God. Spinoza elevated God to such an absolute totality that there was no room left for anything else. And there lay the problem. Because if God is everything, if every stone, every animal, every human being, every thought is an expression of God, then no part of creation can be closer to God than another. No people can be God's chosen, because God does not choose. God simply is. No text can be the word of God in a privileged way, because every word, every human thought, is equally an expression of God within the system. No miracle is possible, because a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and the laws of nature are the laws of God, and God does not violate his own laws. The universe operates according to absolute necessity, and what seems like a miracle is simply something we do not yet understand. No special revelation is possible, because God does not speak to specific people at specific moments, transmitting messages that others have not heard. The voice of God is the structure of the entire universe available to anyone who has eyes, reason, to read. No divine intervention in human history is possible, because intervention implies that God acts from the outside, upon the universe, like a player moving the pieces. In Spinoza's system, God is not outside the universe. God is the universe. The pieces are God. The board is God. The whole game is God. For institutionalized religions, Judaism, Catholicism, Protestantism, this view was not just wrong, it was the end, because what gives authority to a religious institution is precisely the idea that God communicates in a privileged way through specific channels, specific texts, specific prophets, specific rituals, specific clerics, and that the institution is the guardian of those channels. If God is everything and is in everything and expresses himself equally in everything, there is no privileged channel. There is no guardian. The institution loses its reason for being. Hence the violence of the reaction, hence the burned books, the decrees of prohibition, the cherem and the episcopal edicts and the lists of prohibited books. It was not persecution of an abstract idea. It was self-preservation of power systems that instinctively understood that Spinoza had placed a bomb at the foundation upon which they were built. After everything disappears, what remains? Not in a dramatic sense. I'm not talking about catastrophe or sudden collapse. I'm talking about the kind of disappearance that happens when you choose to leave everything that was your life. When you walk through a door and the door closes behind you, and you know because you are that kind of person, that you will not return. What remains is the essential, and the essential, for Baruch Spinoza, was surprisingly simple. A room, a table, books, paper, a pen, enough light to write, and the freedom to think what he wanted to think. Spinoza moved several times in the years following his excommunication. First to the outskirts of Amsterdam, then to Rijnsburg, a small town near Leiden, where there was a community of Mennonites, dissenting Christians who practiced a form of religious tolerance that at that time was extraordinarily rare. Then to Voorburg near The Hague, and finally to The Hague, where he would live until he died. Each place was modest, rented rooms in family homes that welcomed him with a mix of curiosity and respect. There was no luxury, no special comfort. There was the necessary, a bed, a table, access to a kitchen, and the silent understanding of the homeowners that their guest needed quiet to work. The work that paid the bills was polishing glass lenses. The art of optics was in full swing in the 17th century. Telescopes and microscopes were relatively new instruments. Galileo had pointed a telescope at the sky decades earlier and discovered the moons of Jupiter, overturning centuries of certainty about the structure of the cosmos. Leeuwenhoek, a contemporary of Spinoza in The Hague, was using microscopes to discover microorganisms, creatures invisible to the naked eye that existed in teeth, in puddles, in human blood itself. The lenses that made all this possible had to be polished by hand, with a patience and precision that required considerable skill. Spinoza learned this craft from Van den Enden or from artisans in Amsterdam and developed a reputation for excellence that extended beyond philosophical circles. There are letters from scientists requesting lenses from Spinoza. There are records that Leibniz, the great German philosopher and mathematician, when he visited The Hague to meet in person the man he had read about with growing astonishment, found him in his room with a lens in hand. The irony is too evident not to mention. The man who spent his life trying to see more clearly than anyone before him was paying his bills by making instruments for others to see better. But it was not bitter irony. Spinoza chose this work consciously. There were other options, and he explicitly refused them. In 1673, Elector Palatine Karl Ludwig sent Spinoza, through an intermediary, an invitation to take a chair in philosophy at the University of Heidelberg. It was one of the most prestigious academic positions available in Europe. Guaranteed salary, public recognition, access to intellectual resources, the possibility of influencing generations of students. The letter from the intermediary, which has survived, specified that Spinoza would have the broadest freedom to philosophize, and that the elector hoped he would not abuse that freedom to publicly disturb the established religion. That last sentence was enough. Spinoza replied, courteously, with gratitude for the consideration, but with absolute clarity. He said that he was not sure that his freedom to philosophize was sufficiently protected by that formulation, that the limits of what could disturb the established religion would be defined by others, not by him, and that he preferred to remain where he was. The response was elegant, but the decision was simple. Spinoza did not trade freedom for security, under no circumstances, for no price, not because he was ascetic or masochistic, not because he despised comfort, but because he understood, and this is one of the central points of his philosophy, that a specific type of freedom, once lost, is not recovered. The freedom to think what you really think, without filtering thought by what is permitted or by what will please those who pay your salary, is the only type of freedom that produces real knowledge. Everything else is performance, and Spinoza was not interested in performance. Spinoza's correspondence was published posthumously and is, in itself, one of the most fascinating documents of European intellectual history of the 17th century. They are letters exchanged with philosophers, scientists, merchants, theologians, members of the nobility, and ordinary citizens who had read something he had written or had heard of him through the networks of intellectuals that existed at that time. What stands out in these letters is not only the content, although the content is extraordinary, it is the tone. Spinoza responded to everyone, to the student who had read a summary of his ideas and wanted to understand better, to the conservative theologian who wrote to say that he was wrong and that the Bible proved it, to the mathematician who had a technical objection to one of his demonstrations, to the enthusiastic young person who wanted to know if he should drop everything and dedicate himself to philosophy. He responded to everyone with the same quality of attention, without impatience, without the arrogance of the genius who has no time for smaller questions, with a patience that seemed genuine, not performative, not the forced patience of someone controlling themselves, but the natural patience of someone who truly believes that every honest question deserves an honest answer. There is a letter to a young man who asked whether he should become a philosopher. Spinoza responded with a disconcerting honesty. He said that philosophy does not bring happiness in the common sense of the word. It leads to a form of peace that is deeper than conventional happiness, but it is also lonelier. Only those who cannot help but follow this path should do so, because if there is a choice, it is better to choose something else. It was Spinoza describing himself. There was no choice. What he had been writing all those years, while polishing lenses and answering letters and living in rented rooms, was the book, the ethics. It was not a linear project. It was something that grew in a spiral. He revisited sections, reformulated demonstrations, abandoned arguments that did not hold up, and built better ones. The letters show thought in process. You can see, in the exchanges with correspondents, where Spinoza tests ideas before consolidating them, where he perceives an objection he had not considered, where he finds a formulation that works better than the previous one. The method of the ethics, organizing philosophy like geometry, with definitions, axioms, propositions, and demonstrations, was not just a matter of style. It was a philosophical statement in itself. It meant, this is not poetry, it is not metaphor, it is not mystical intuition that you have to accept on faith. It is reasoning. Each step necessarily follows from the previous one. If you accept the definitions and axioms, the propositions that follow are not opinions, they are consequences. And if you want to reject the conclusions, you have to find the error in the reasoning. You have to show which definition is wrong or which step does not follow from the previous one. It was a challenge. No one fully accepted it, but no one completely refuted it either, and that says it all. Spinoza's life in The Hague in his last years has a quality of quietude that biographers describe with a kind of astonishment. It was not the quietism of someone who had given up. It was the quietude of someone who had arrived somewhere. He had friends, not many, but real, people who came regularly to his room to talk, who corresponded with him, who took care of him when he fell ill, who recognized the privilege of being in the presence of an intelligence of that level. The owner of the house where he lived in his last years, Hendrik van der Spik, recorded memories of their time together that reveal a man who laughed, who enjoyed a good conversation, who liked to watch spiders weaving their webs. He used this observation, according to van der Spik, to think about the nature of survival and animal intelligence. There was no bitterness. There are letters from the last years that have a lightness, a satisfied precision, that suggest a man at peace, not the peace of someone who has everything they want, the peace of someone who understands the difference between what they need and what they do not need, and who has spent their life organizing their existence around that distinction. Spinoza called this beatitudo, blessedness, not in the religious sense of heavenly reward, in the philosophical sense of a way of being in the world that is sustainable, that does not depend on external circumstances, that is not shaken by the fluctuations of fortune. It was what he had built, brick by brick, over 30 years of life after excommunication. His lungs had been giving out over the years. The glass dust, an inevitable result of polishing lenses, which he did without proper protection because adequate protection simply did not exist in the 17th century, had caused damage that the medicine of the time did not know how to diagnose accurately, but that doctors recognize by the symptoms: cough, difficulty breathing, the progressive slowness of an organism being destroyed from within. At the end of February 1677, Spinoza worsened. Van der Spaak went to fetch him from his room on a Sunday morning. The family had gone to church and found him alive but clearly close to the end. He died that afternoon. He was 44 years old. On the table, manuscripts, letters, and the book, the Ethics, complete, bound, waiting for what he had requested, to be published, without his name on the cover. The circle of closest friends, the amici that Spinoza had cultivated over the years, ensured that the manuscripts reached Amsterdam, that they were printed, that they circulated. The book appeared at the end of 1677, months after his death, with the title Opera Posthuma, Posthumous Works. The Ethics was there, complete, with the definitions and axioms and propositions and demonstrations that he had built over 20 years in small rooms, smelling of polished glass and oil lamps. It was banned the same year, by the Dutch, by the French, by the Germans, by the Church, and it circulated across the continent with the force of things that are forbidden, hidden in luggage, copied by hand, passed from hand to hand in cities and universities, by people who knew they were holding something too important to let die. Have you ever wondered why mathematics works? Not how it works, not the equations, not the algorithms. Why? For what reason does a series of abstract symbols, manipulated according to rules that a human mind invented, describe with extraordinary precision the behavior of physical reality? Why does 2 + 2 = 4 on paper, and also when you have 2 apples and add 2 more? Why does Maxwell's equation for electromagnetism, derived in the 19th century by a Scottish mathematician from purely theoretical considerations, describe exactly how electric and magnetic fields behave in nature? Why does the geometry that Euclid formulated in Alexandria 2,300 years ago still perfectly describe the space in which you live and move? This question has a name among philosophers: the problem of the unreasonable applicability of mathematics, and to this day it does not have a completely satisfactory answer. Spinoza had one. Mathematics works because reality and thought are 2 attributes of the same substance. They are the same God seen from 2 different angles, and when thought, using its own internal tools, logic, deduction, mathematical necessity, arrives at a structure, that structure corresponds to reality because the 2 are the same at bottom. It is not a simple answer, but it is coherent, and it has a beauty that does not depend on faith. That is why Spinoza organized the Ethics as a geometric treatise, not out of intellectual exhibitionism, not to seem more rigorous than he was, but because the method was the message. Because if thought and reality are the same, then the rigor of pure thought must correspond to the rigor of reality. And the purest form of rigorous thought that humans had developed was Euclidean geometry, where each assertion necessarily follows from definitions and axioms, with no room for the vague, the approximate, for more or less. The Ethics has 5 parts. The first is called De Deo, on God. It begins with 8 definitions. The first, by cause of itself, I understand that which essence involves existence, or that which nature cannot be conceived of except as existing. In more direct language, cause of itself is something that exists necessarily, that cannot not exist, whose very concept implies existence. This seems abstract until you realize what Spinoza is doing. He is establishing right at the beginning that there are 2 types of things: those that depend on something else to exist, you, me, the chair, the planet, and the thing that exists by necessity without depending on anything external. There can only be one thing that exists by itself. If there were 2, each would be a limit to the other, and a limited thing does not exist completely independently. This thing that exists necessarily, that is cause of itself, that is not limited by anything external, is what Spinoza calls God, or nature, the unique and infinite substance. The second definition is about what it means to be finite. And here Spinoza makes an observation that seems technical, but is fundamental. Something is finite when it can be limited by something else of the same nature. A thought is limited by other thoughts. You cannot think two things at the same time with equal intensity. A body is limited by other bodies. Two bodies cannot occupy the same space. But a thought is not limited by a body, nor a body by a thought. They are different natures that do not limit each other. This will be important later. The third definition is about substance. By substance, I understand that which exists in itself and is conceived by itself, or that whose concept does not require the concept of another thing from which it must be formed. Substance is what exists without depending on anything. What you can understand without needing to understand anything else beforehand. The stone that you kicked on the sidewalk is not substance in that sense. To understand the stone, you need to understand silicon, calcium carbonate, geological processes, time, pressure. The stone depends on all of this to be what it is. What would true substance be? What would exist without needing anything external to exist? The fourth definition is about attribute. By attribute, I mean that which the intellect perceives as constituting the essence of substance. An attribute is how substance appears to a mind that perceives it. It is the angle from which a finite mind sees infinite substance. We, human beings, perceive substance through two attributes, thought and extension. We think, and we can perceive thought. We have bodies that occupy space, and we can perceive extension. But substance has infinite attributes, infinite ways of being, of which we perceive only two because we are finite. The fifth definition is about mode. By mode, I mean the affections of a substance, that is, that which exists in another thing, through which it is also conceived. Mode is what exists not by itself but as an expression of another thing. The wave is a mode of the ocean. The specific thought you are having right now is a mode of the attribute thought of substance. Your body is a mode of the attribute extension of substance. You are a mode of God or nature, not a separate creature, a mode, a form of expression. From definitions, Spinoza moves to axioms. Axioms are statements that he considers self-evidently true, that any rational mind, upon consideration, will recognize as true without the need for proof. The first axiom: everything that exists exists in itself or in another thing, in itself as substance or in another thing as mode. There is no third option. The second axiom: that which cannot be conceived through another thing must be conceived by itself. If you need to understand something by reference to another thing, that other thing is more fundamental. If you arrive at something that is understood without reference to anything external, you have reached the fundamental, and so on. 7 axioms in total, each apparently simple, but together they build a structure that will support the weight of the entire edifice that follows. From definitions and axioms, Spinoza derives propositions. 36 propositions in just the first part of the Ethics about God, each with a demonstration that explicitly cites which definitions, axioms, and previous propositions it is using. It is like a chain. You pull one link and all the others come along. Proposition 1 states, substance is prior by nature to its affections. Demonstration. It follows directly from the definitions of substance and mode. Substance exists in itself. Modes exist in substance. What exists in itself is logically prior to what exists in another thing. Proposition 3 states, things that have nothing in common with each other cannot be the cause of one another. This seems obvious but has consequences. If thought and matter are completely different, as Descartes said, then a thought cannot cause a physical movement, and a physical movement cannot cause a thought. Descartes' mind-body problem, put in rigorous terms, generates a contradiction. The only solution is that thought and matter are not fundamentally different. They are two aspects of the same. Proposition 5 is where things get interesting. In the nature of things, there cannot exist two or more substances of the same nature or attribute. Demonstration. If there were two substances with the same attribute, one could be distinguished from the other only by its modes. But modes are affections of substance, not substance itself. Substance, considered in itself one without modes, would be indistinguishable from the other. But two indistinguishable things are the same thing. Contradiction. Therefore, for each attribute, there exists only one substance. And since God has all attributes, by definition God is absolutely infinite, which means he has all possible attributes. There exists only one substance. God is the only substance. Everything else is a mode of God. Proposition 11 is the one that makes readers stop and reread. God, or a substance that consists of infinite attributes, each of which expresses an eternal and infinite essence, exists necessarily. God does not exist as you or I exist, contingently, possibly not having existed if circumstances were different. God exists necessarily. He cannot not exist. The essence of God involves existence, just like in the first definition. And here Spinoza offers several parallel demonstrations of the same proposition, as if he wants to show that no matter from what angle you approach, the conclusion is the same. One of the demonstrations: for anything that exists, there is a reason for it to exist, and for anything that does not exist, there is also a reason for it not to exist. The reason can be internal or external. In the case of God, of infinite substance, there can be no external reason, because there is nothing external to God. Therefore, if God does not exist, the reason must be internal, a contradiction in the nature of God. But the nature of God is consistent by definition. It is infinite and has no gaps. Therefore, there is no reason for God not to exist. Therefore, God exists. The demonstration is not simple at first impact, but when you follow it slowly, step by step, something happens, a kind of fitting, the feeling that the arguments close in on themselves with a precision that leaves no escape. But what does this logical structure have to do with the real world? Everything. Because if God is the only substance, and everything that exists is modes of that substance, then physics, the science that studies how bodies behave in space, is the study of how the modes of the attribute extension function. And psychology, the science that studies how the mind functions, is the study of how the modes of the attribute thought function. And both study the same reality. From different angles with different vocabularies, what physics discovers about the universe corresponds to what psychology discovers about the mind, not by coincidence, but by necessity, because they are two angles on the same thing. Einstein intuited this when he spoke of a unified theory of everything, when he sought an equation that would describe all physical phenomena in a common language. He did not get there. But the intuition that it should exist, that the diversity of physical phenomena must have an underlying unity, was exactly Spinozist. They were the same premonition, expressed in the vocabularies of 3 different centuries. The second part of the ethics is called On the Nature and Origin of the Mind. This is where Spinoza resolves the mind-body problem that Descartes had left open, and he resolves it in a way that anticipates debates that the philosophy of mind and neuroscience still engage in today. The solution begins with Proposition 7 of the second part. The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. This is one of the densest and most fertile phrases in all of Western philosophy. It means the sequence by which thoughts connect in the mind corresponds to the sequence by which things connect in physical reality. Not because one causes the other, because they are the same thing described in 2 vocabularies. The idea of a triangle and the physical triangle do not have a cause and effect relationship. They are the same structure, the same necessary form that substance takes, viewed from the angle of thought and the angle of extension. And here is the most dizzying consequence. The human mind for Spinoza is not a mysterious thing separate from the body. It is the idea of the body. It is the way in which the attribute thought expresses exactly the same configuration that the attribute extension expresses as body. Your thought and your body do not interact. They are the same, described in 2 ways. When you feel pain, when a physical object damages your body, that is simultaneously and by the same process a modification of your mind. Not because the body sent a signal to the mind, because body and mind are 2 angles on the same modification of substance. This has a consequence that contemporary neuroscience confirms in ways that Spinoza could not have imagined. Every emotion has a physical correlate. When you feel fear, your heart races, your muscles tense, cortisol floods your bloodstream. When you feel love, other chemicals, other bodily configurations. There is no emotion that does not have a physical equivalent. There is no mental state that does not correspond to a brain state. For contemporary neuroscience, this is an empirical discovery. For Spinoza, it was a necessary deduction from the nature of substance. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio wrote an entire book about Spinoza and the actual threat. This understanding allows you to respond to the situation with clarity and intention rather than being overwhelmed by an automatic reaction. You can choose to move forward cautiously or to retreat if necessary based on a rational assessment of the situation rather than being driven solely by fear. This distinction between servitude and freedom is crucial in Spinoza's philosophy. He emphasizes that true freedom comes from understanding our emotions and the causes behind them, allowing us to act in accordance with our own nature rather than being at the mercy of external forces. By cultivating this understanding, we can navigate our emotional landscape more effectively, making choices that align with our true selves. Spinoza's insights into the nature of emotions and their relationship to reason challenge traditional views that see emotions as obstacles to rational thought. Instead, he presents a more integrated perspective, where emotions are seen as essential components of our human experience. They provide valuable information about our interactions with the world and can guide us in making decisions that enhance our well-being. In this light, emotions are not merely to be controlled or suppressed, they are to be understood and embraced. By acknowledging the role of emotions in our lives, we can develop a more nuanced approach to our experiences, recognizing that they are not inherently good or bad, but rather indicators of our state of being. Spinoza's philosophy encourages us to cultivate emotional awareness and intelligence. This involves not only recognizing our own emotions, but also understanding the emotions of others. By fostering empathy and compassion, we can create deeper connections and navigate social interactions more effectively. Ultimately, Spinoza's work invites us to reconsider our relationship with our emotions. Rather than viewing them as adversaries to reason, we can see them as allies that enrich our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. This shift in perspective has profound implications for how we approach our emotional lives, leading to greater self-awareness, resilience, and fulfillment. In conclusion, Spinoza's exploration of emotions and their interplay with reason offers a transformative framework for understanding human experience. By embracing the complexity of our emotional landscape, we can cultivate a deeper sense of freedom and agency in our lives, allowing us to navigate the challenges of existence with greater clarity and purpose. Between real threat and imagined threat. When you understand fear for what it is, an automatic response of the organism to a stimulus perceived as a threat, you gain the ability to work with it, not to eliminate it, to use it as information, to integrate it into action, to be determined not only by the automatic reflex but by the understanding that frames it. This, for Spinoza, is freedom, and it is attainable, not perfectly. No finite human being achieves perfect freedom because there are always external causes that we do not fully understand, but as an ideal towards which one can progress. The more you understand, the more you comprehend your own nature, the causes of your emotions, the laws that govern your functioning as a being in the world, the closer you come to being determined by your own nature and not by external forces that sweep you away like winds you cannot see. Freud arrived at some of these conclusions through a completely different path. Decades of clinical work with patients, analyzed dreams, mapped resistances, gradually revealed structures of the unconscious. What Freud called the unconscious, forces that determine our behavior without our knowing, Spinoza called misunderstood external causes. What Freud referred to as therapeutic insight, the moment when the patient understands a connection that was previously opaque, Spinoza would call progress towards freedom. Psychoanalysis and Spinoza's philosophy reached similar conclusions about human psychology through radically different methods. This convergence between 17th century philosophy and 20th century clinical practice is no coincidence. It is the same phenomenon observed from different angles. Like thought and extension in ethics, the same reality, two vocabularies. At some point tonight, perhaps while you sleep, perhaps while you dream, billions of cells in your body will die. It is not drama, it is physiology. It is metabolism at work, the organism renewing itself, life maintaining its own structure through a continuous process of destruction and reconstruction that never stops while you are alive. You tomorrow are not exactly you today. Most of the cells that make up your liver now did not exist 2 years ago. The atoms that form your bones are replaced over decades. In some literal and verifiable sense, you are a process, not a static thing, but a pattern that persists while the elements that compose it flow and change. And one day, that pattern dissolves. That is the question that all religions were created to answer, that all philosophy at some point has to confront, that every human being who thinks with some depth eventually faces in that unusual moment of silence that life grants from time to time, and needs to decide what to do with it. What happens next? Spinoza had an answer. It was not the answer that religions provided. It was not the answer that common sense would expect from someone who had thought about death with the seriousness that he had. It was an answer that, when you truly understand it, when you follow it to the end without simplifying it to make it more comfortable, has a strangeness that is both disturbing and strangely comforting. Let us begin with what Spinoza did not believe. He did not believe in personal immortality in the sense that most religions describe it. There is no individual soul that survives the body, that retains its memories and identity, that goes to a specific place after death and eventually reunites with other souls. For Spinoza, this was impossible by the logic of the system he had constructed. If mind and body are two attributes of the same substance, if they are two angles on the same configuration of the modes of God, then the dissolution of the bodily pattern necessarily implies the dissolution of the mental pattern that corresponds to it. You think with a brain. The brain is the idea of the body, the mode of the attribute thought that corresponds to the mode of the attribute extension that is your physical body. When the body dissolves, the pattern of thought that corresponded to that specific body also dissolves. There is no separate soul that flies off to another place. This seems brutal, cold, the darkest conclusion that a materialistic mind could draw. But Spinoza did not stop here, because there was a second step in the reasoning, a step that most superficial readings of his thought on death fail to see. Proposition 23 of the fifth part of Ethics states, "The human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the body, but something of it remains that is eternal." How? If the individual pattern dissolves with the body, what remains? The answer requires you to return to the fundamental distinction of Spinoza's system, the distinction between what is eternal and what is temporal, between what exists sub specie aeternitatis, under the aspect of eternity, and what exists sub specie durationis, under the aspect of duration, of time. Everything that exists has two aspects, a temporal aspect, its particular existence at a specific moment, with a specific configuration that began at one point and will end at another, and an eternal aspect, its essence, the necessity by which something is what it is, regardless of when it exists or for how long. You, as a particular individual, exist temporally. You were born, you will die. This specific configuration of thoughts and memories and experiences that is you exists in a finite duration, but the essence of what you are, the necessary form that substance takes when it expresses itself as you, that does not exist in time. It is in the eternal structure of substance, like the relationship between the sides of a triangle is in the eternal structure of geometry. The specific triangle you drew on a piece of paper will disappear when the paper deteriorates. But the relationship it exemplified, the necessity that the angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees, that does not disappear. It was not on the paper. It was in the structure of geometric space. In the same way, you as a particular pattern will disappear. But what you are in essence, your way of being, your specific manner of existing as a knot in the infinite network of substance, that has an aspect that does not exist in time, and therefore does not die with time. This seems like an abstract consolation, too far removed to function as an answer to death. And Spinoza knew that. He was not trying to console, he was trying to describe. But there is a practical dimension to this view of death that is not immediately obvious, and that, when you see it, changes the relationship with mortality in a way that goes beyond consolation. Human life, for most of the time, is lived under the aspect of duration. You think about the past and what happened, what was lost, what should have been different. You think about the future, what will happen, what you fear, what you hope for. You oscillate between memory and anticipation, between nostalgia and anxiety. The present, the moment when life really happens, is constantly sacrificed to this oscillation. Spinoza said that the good life, what he called beatitudo, blessedness, is precisely the state in which you can perceive your existence sub specie aeternitatis, not as a sequence of moments that are always passing, always being lost, always carrying the shadow of the end, but as the necessary expression of an eternal substance, like the wave that while it exists is the ocean. The wave does not suffer from not lasting forever. The wave is ocean in motion. While it exists completely. And when it ceases to exist as a wave, it continues in the ocean, not as memory, not as persistent identity, but as the substance it always was. There is a phrase in the fifth part of Ethics that Spinoza's readers invariably memorize, not because it is the most rigorous or the most technically precise, but because it is the most honest, the most human, the most strangely beautiful that came out of all that geometric structure. The phrase is, "A free man thinks of nothing less than death, and his wisdom is a meditation not on death but on life." Do not think of death, think of life, but not as an escape from the awareness of mortality, not as anesthetic distraction, as the recognition that death is not the problem. The problem, the only thing that truly wastes existence, is living in such a way that life is an anticipation of death instead of a full expression of what you are while you exist. The fear of death, the existential anxiety that permeates so much of human experience, comes, for Spinoza, from the same source of all human suffering. From servitude, from being governed by external causes that one does not understand, from oscillating between hopes and fears about the future, about building identity on things that are by nature perishable. Freedom, beatitudo, is the state in which you exist in the present. Understand your own nature, act from that understanding, and experience life not as a countdown, but as the expression, while it lasts, of something eternal. Einstein returned to Spinoza on this specific point, not in the equations, not in physics, but when he spoke about what he called the oceanic feeling, the experience, which he described as central to his intellectual and emotional life, of perceiving himself as part of something immeasurably greater, not God in the personal sense, not a presence that loved him or cared about his particular destiny, but order, the mathematical beauty underlying every physical phenomenon, the coherence that made the universe intelligible, the necessity that made the equations have to be as they were. When Einstein said he felt humility before the universe, he wasn't being modest about performance. He was literally describing the experience of realizing that what he was, a brilliant physicist in a Princeton lab, was a mode of something that went far beyond any individual identity. It was Spinoza's God, experienced not as a philosophical doctrine, but as a lived feeling. What does all this mean to you? I won't answer, not because I'm being evasive, because Spinoza himself would be the first to say that imported answers don't work, that the whole point of his philosophy is to offer tools for understanding, not to prescribe conclusions. What I can say is this: if you've listened carefully so far, if you've followed the logic of the system, if you've followed the man and the ideas and what it cost to build them, then something has changed in the way you perceive the universe around you. Perhaps just a millimeter, but millimeters accumulate. The stone you kick on the sidewalk is no longer just inert matter. It's a mode of God, of the unique substance that necessarily exists and expresses itself in everything that is. The thought you are having now is not an isolated event in a mind separate from the universe. It is the substance knowing itself through you at this specific moment, and you, with your memories and your fears and your desires and your questions, are not a stranger lost in an indifferent universe. It is the universe for a moment becoming aware of itself. There is a question that governments of all times have tried to answer in their favor. How far does the power of the state extend over the individual? Can the state tell you what you should eat, whom you should marry, what you should believe, what you can say in public? Can it enter your mind and reorganize it according to the interests of power? In 1670, 6 years before his death, Spinoza published the most dangerous book he had written up to that point, and he published it during his lifetime, a rare thing for him, who preferred anonymity and manuscripts circulating in secret. The book was called Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. It was banned in less than a year, and in it Spinoza said something that no philosopher had said so clearly before. The state has no power over thought. It never has, it never will. Not because thought is sacred in a religious sense, but because it is impossible. You can force a man to say he believes in something. You cannot force him to believe. You can punish those who express certain ideas. You cannot erase ideas. You can burn books. You cannot burn the human capacity to reach the same conclusions again. The attempt to control thought does not protect the state. It destroys the state. Because a state that fears free thought is a state that has lost confidence in its own reason for existing. Spinoza was the first modern Western philosopher to systematically argue for freedom of expression, not as a generous concession of power, but as a necessary condition for any healthy society. Not because free ideas are always correct, because suppressing them ensures that incorrect ones are never corrected. Truth needs freedom to emerge. In an environment of censorship, what wins is not the truest idea, it is the idea of the most powerful. Spinoza was not naive about power. He had read Machiavelli. He had studied Hobbes. I understood that human beings are neither naturally rational nor naturally cooperative, that fear and desire govern most human actions most of the time. But I also understood that this did not justify despotism. On the contrary, it justified democracy, not as an abstract ideal but as a practical arrangement that recognizes human nature as it is. In a democracy, collective decisions pass through the filter of many minds. No single mind is wise enough, free enough from self-interest, or capable enough to see all angles of a problem to be trusted with absolute power. The distribution of power is not a luxury. It is a safeguard against corruption. The inevitable fallibility of humankind was a radical notion in 1670. Europe was ruled by absolutist monarchs who derived their authority from God or claimed to. Questioning the legitimacy of absolute power was, in many countries, treason. Spinoza questioned it, with the same calm with which he questioned everything, and the ideas he put forth in the Tractatus on freedom of expression, on the separation of religion and state, on the rational foundation of political authority, would reappear 100 years later in the American and French constitutions. The drafters of these constitutions did not cite Spinoza by name. That would be too dangerous. But they had read him, and the marks were there. Spinoza did not hate religion. This needs to be stated clearly, because a superficial reading of his story, the excommunicated boy who spent his life fighting faith, is a caricature that betrays the complexity of what he truly thought. What Spinoza did with religion was more surgical than hatred. It was analysis, an X-ray. The attempt to understand where it comes from, what it serves, where it helps, and where it deceives. And the diagnosis was sophisticated. Religion, Spinoza argued, has two layers. The outer layer, rituals, texts, institutions, hierarchies, dogmas, the social and political apparatus that has been built around religious experience over millennia. This layer is a human work. It didn't descend from heaven. It was built by people in specific historical contexts, with objectives that mixed the genuine with the convenient. The inner layer, the profound intuition, which he called amor intellectualis Dei, intellectual love of God, that we are part of something infinite, that existence has a coherence that transcends the individual, that there is beauty and order in the structure of the universe that deserves something akin to reverence. Spinoza not only respected this inner layer, it was, in a way, the heart of his entire philosophy. The problem, the only problem, but it was enormous, was when the outer layer claimed to be the inner layer, when the institution claimed to be the sacred, when the text claimed to be the literal word of God, when the ritual claimed to be the privileged access to the divine. Because at that moment, the outer layer began to block the inner layer. The institution replaced experience. Authority replaced reason. And the human being, instead of being led to an understanding of the whole of which he is a part, was kept in a relationship of dependence on the structure that claimed to mediate this understanding. Spinoza called this superstition. Not with mockery, with clinical sadness. Superstition is not belief in the supernatural. It is the substitution of understanding for obedience. It is accepting an image of God, made by humans in specific historical circumstances, and treating that image as if it were reality. And the consequences of this substitution were, for Spinoza, tragic, because the image of God that historical religions constructed was, in most cases, the image of an absolute king, a sovereign who chooses favorites, who demands obedience, who punishes disobedience, who intervenes in human history according to preferences that often seem to coincide with the interests of those who interpret his will. This God is useful for those who want to maintain power. It has no necessary relation to the actual structure of the universe. Spinoza's proposal was not to destroy religion, it was to purify it, to return religious experience to what was genuine in it, the wonder at the order of the universe, the perception that we are part of something immense, the love that emerges from understanding instead of fearing, and to separate this from the historical apparatus that had accumulated around this experience, and that often suffocated it instead of nourishing it. True religion, for Spinoza, does not require intermediaries. It does not require sacred texts that only the initiated can interpret. It does not require sacrifices, pilgrimages, purification rituals. It requires only understanding. The more you understand the universe, the more reason illuminates the structure of what exists, the closer you get to the intellectual love of God. Not because God loves you back, in a personal sense, but because understanding the whole of which you are a part is the only form of freedom that a finite being can achieve. Einstein again. The most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion that is at the origin of true art and science. It was Spinoza, 300 years later, speaking through the mouth of a physicist. There is a historical convention that places the European Enlightenment, that extraordinary intellectual movement of the 18th century that produced the French Encyclopedia, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the separation of church and state, individual rights, science as the foundation of knowledge. There is a convention that places this movement beginning with Locke, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau. These are the names that appear in textbooks. Those that are cited. Spinoza is often mentioned in discourses about democracy and freedom. He rarely appears on that list, but historians who study the period closely know something that textbooks hide. Spinoza was there before all of them, and the ideas they made famous had, in most cases, direct roots in what he had written. Jonathan Israel, one of the greatest historians of the Enlightenment, spent decades documenting what he called the radical Enlightenment, the most profound and consequential current of the 18th century, which went beyond moderate reforms and questioned the very foundations of the European religious and political order. And the gravitational center of this radical Enlightenment, according to Israel, was Spinoza. Not through direct and openly cited influence. Quoting Spinoza was still dangerous, still associated with atheism and subversion, but through the underground circulation of ideas, through manuscripts that passed from hand to hand in private libraries, through conversations in cafes and salons, where the Tractatus and the Ethics were discussed by people who would never quote them in public. The separation of religion and state, Spinoza. The idea that political authority derives from the consent of the governed, not from a divine mandate, Spinoza. Freedom of expression as an inalienable right, Spinoza. The historical critique of sacred texts, Spinoza. The fundamental equality of human beings regardless of origin or belief, Spinoza. All of this existed, precisely formulated and rigorously defended in the books that had been burned 100 years earlier. The flames had not reached the ideas. Voltaire, who was never generous with his contemporaries or predecessors, acknowledged Spinoza with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. That is perhaps the most honest praise you can receive from Voltaire. He said that Spinoza had destroyed popular theology with a clarity that no one before had achieved. And he said this as a complaint, because the destruction had been so complete that it made the moderate project of religious reform that Voltaire himself advocated more difficult. Spinoza had gone too far, which is, depending on how you look at it, the same thing as saying he had come too close to the truth. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, the book published in 1670, was the first modern Western text to treat the Bible as a historical document, not as profanation, as a method. Spinoza argued that to understand what the Bible means, you have to understand when it was written, by whom, for whom, and with what objectives. That a text produced in a specific culture, in a specific language, for a specific audience, cannot be read as if it were a message without context sent by the eternal to the universal. This seems obvious today. In the 17th century, it was declared heresy, and it is the basis of all modern biblical criticism. The academic field that in 19th century universities revolutionized theology, that produced the historical studies of Jesus, that separated the historical Jesus from the theological Christ, that mapped the sources of the Pentateuch and the different authors behind the Gospels. All of this begins, methodologically, with Spinoza's Tractatus. The 19th century German theologians who built this field rarely mentioned it, but the debt was there, in the method, in the approach, in the willingness to treat the sacred text with the same analytical tools as any other historical document. There is a type of influence that doesn't appear in footnotes, not the direct quotation, as Spinoza said, but the absorption so profound of an idea that it becomes part of the structure of the heir's thought, that he no longer needs to quote, because he can no longer distinguish where the other's idea ends and where his own begins. This type of influence is deeper than quotation. It is more lasting, and that is exactly how Spinoza operated on the greatest thinkers of the 2 centuries that followed his death. Hegel said that to begin doing philosophy, it was necessary to first bathe in Spinoza. It was not a vague compliment. It was a precise description of how Hegel's system was constructed. Hegel's central idea that reality is a process of self-development of the spirit, that the universe is a totality that knows itself through history and human thought, is in many respects Spinoza set in motion. Spinoza had said, "There is a single substance that expresses itself through infinite modes. Thought and extension are 2 angles on this substance." Hegel took this structure and added time. He added history. He said, "Substance is not static. It develops. The spirit unfolds through human history, in each era understanding itself better towards a total self-consciousness." It was Spinoza with dialectics, Spinoza in motion. Marx read Hegel and did to him what Hegel had done to Spinoza. He took the structure and turned it around. Hegel had said that it is the spirit, what moves history. Marx said, no, it is matter. It is the material conditions of production, the economic relations, the concrete structure of how human beings produce what they need to survive. But the idea that everything is interconnected, that the individual cannot be understood outside the totality in which he exists, that consciousness is determined by the conditions of existence and not the other way around, that is Spinoza, passing through Hegel, arriving at Marx. Spinoza's determinism, the idea that everything happens by necessity, that there are no accidents, that what seems like free will is misunderstood determinism, reappears in the Marxist theory of historical determinism, in the idea that economic forces develop according to necessary laws, independently of individual will. Marx was never an avowed Spinozist, but historians of ideas see the legacy on every page. Nietzsche is the most dramatic case. Nietzsche, who shouted, "God is dead," seemed the opposite of everything Spinoza had built. But when you look closer, the similarity is disconcerting. Spinoza's conatus, the striving of each thing to persevere and expand its being, reappears in Nietzsche as will to power. Not the will to dominate others, but the fundamental impulse of every living being to expand, create, surpass itself. Spinoza's critique of the morality of obedience, the idea that virtue is submission to an external law, reappears in Nietzsche as a critique of slave morality, the ethics of resentment that calls impotence virtue. Spinoza's idea that freedom is being determined by one's own nature, not the absence of determination, but understood self-determination, reappears in Nietzsche as the ideal of the Übermensch, the being who creates his own values instead of inheriting them. Nietzsche acknowledged the affinity with Spinoza in an 1881 letter, describing the experience of rereading the Ethics as discovering a predecessor. With a mixture of enthusiasm and intellectual jealousy that was very Nietzschean, Freud is the most honest of the four about the debt, not in technical texts, references there are scarce, but in letters, in conversations, in later statements. Freud acknowledged that the idea that unconscious forces determine conscious behavior, the cornerstone of all psychoanalysis, had deep roots in Spinoza. The analysis of affects in the Ethics, the cataloguing of emotions as natural forces that follow precise laws, the idea that not understanding the causes of one's own emotions is the root of psychological servitude, is the psychology of the unconscious, before the unconscious had that name. Freud called it the unconscious. Spinoza called it misunderstood external causes. Freud called it therapeutic insight. Spinoza called it progress toward freedom. The method was different. The consulting room versus the philosopher's chair, dreams and transference and resistance versus definitions and axioms and propositions. But the fundamental discovery was the same. We are moved by more than we know. Understanding what motivates us is the only way to avoid being swept away by it. God does not play dice. This is the most famous phrase Einstein ever uttered about God. It was spoken in response to quantum mechanics, the discovery that at the subatomic level, nature seems fundamentally probabilistic, that you cannot predict with certainty where a particle will be, only calculate the probability. For Einstein, this was unacceptable, not for religious reasons in the conventional sense, for Spinozian reasons. If God is the necessary structure of the universe, if the laws of nature are the expression of God's nature, then this structure must be determined, complete, without gaps where chance enters. Spinoza's universe is a universe where everything happens out of necessity, where what we call chance is simply ignorance of causes, where if you knew the position and momentum of every particle in the universe, you could perfectly predict everything that will happen next. Einstein believed in this universe. He spent the last 30 years of his life searching for a unified theory that would describe this universe in an equation, one that would show that apparent quantum randomness was a result of our ignorance of hidden variables, not the actual structure of reality. He didn't find it. And subsequent experiments, culminating in Bell's experiments in the 1960s and 1970s, suggested that Einstein was wrong, that quantum randomness is not ignorance, it is the nature of reality. This seems like a defeat for Spinoza, but the story is more complicated. Because what quantum physics revealed, and which Einstein resisted until his death, but which the data confirmed, is not chaos. It is a different order, a deeper one. Not the order of billiard balls colliding predictably, but the order of probability patterns that manifest themselves with extraordinary mathematical precision. The quantum universe is not random in the sense of arbitrariness. The concept of quantum mechanics is probabilistic, in the sense that it obeys precise mathematical laws that describe not the individual outcome, but the distribution of outcomes. The Schrödinger equation, which describes how the wave function evolves over time, is as determined as necessary as any equation Newton wrote. The order is there. It just operates in a way that the classical categories of determinism and causality cannot fully capture. Spinoza, of course, could not have anticipated quantum mechanics. His universe was Aristotelianly continuous, classically determined. But the central intuition, that there is a necessary order underlying the apparent diversity and apparent contingency of phenomena, this intuition survives quantum physics. It is confirmed by it in a way that Spinoza could not have predicted, but that perhaps would not have surprised him. What modern neuroscience has done with Spinoza is even more straightforward. Antonio Damasio, a Portuguese neuroscientist who worked for decades with patients with brain lesions, studying how different parts of the brain contribute to emotion, reason, and decision-making, reached conclusions that led him to write an entire book about the relationship between his discoveries and Spinoza's philosophy. The book's title is Meeting Spinoza, and the central thesis is this. Spinoza, without access to any of the instruments of modern neuroscience, had described the relationship between mind and body, between emotion and reason, with a precision that 300 years of science have confirmed rather than refuted. The idea that emotions and reason are not opposites, that emotions are forms of embodied knowledge, that reason without emotion does not produce good decisions. This is what Damasio empirically demonstrated with patients who had damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, who had lost the ability to feel emotions, and who, therefore, had also lost the ability to make reasonable decisions. It was the experiment that Spinoza had done with reason alone 300 years earlier, and he had arrived at the same conclusion. Let's go back to the beginning. A 23-year-old man walks through a synagogue door on a July night in Amsterdam. Curses echo behind him. The family he knew, his childhood friends, the only world that existed for him, it all lies on the other side of that door. He walks through the dark streets, the canal reflecting what little light remains. We don't know what he felt. Nobody knows. What we do know is what he did next. He rented a room, he polished lenses, he wrote 20 years, 2 rooms, 3 cities, a life of productive silence and a freedom he chose each morning, not for lack of options, but because he had understood it was the only way to be entirely who he was. He died at 44, his lungs destroyed by glass dust. With the manuscript on the table, he asked that it be published anonymously. The world discovered the name anyway. What Baruch Spinoza left behind is not an answer. It's a method, a way of looking at the oldest questions that exist, about God, about the mind, about freedom, about death, without retreating, without wrapping the conclusion in sacred language when the conclusion is inconvenient, without stopping at the edge of the abyss and calling the abyss a divine mystery so as not to have to descend. He descended. And what he found down there was not emptiness. It was the same thing that was above. It was the same thing that was everywhere. It was the single, infinite, eternal substance that necessarily exists and expresses itself in everything, in stone and thought, in the vacuum of space and in the emotion you felt a moment ago while listening to this story. Deus sive natura, God or nature, not two things, one. What does this mean for you? It depends on where you arrived here. If you arrived as a believer in a specific religion, Spinoza does not ask you to abandon the experience of sacredness that this religion gave you. He only asks you to examine the difference between the genuine sacred, the wonder, the love, the feeling of belonging to something greater, and the historical apparatus that has been built around this sacredness and that sometimes suffocates it. If you arrived as an atheist or agnostic, Spinoza doesn't invite you back to any God you rejected. He invites you to realize that the word God can name something different from what it has been used to name, that the universe that science describes, with its extraordinary mathematical order, its structural beauty, its coherence that extends from the subatomic to the cosmological, is precisely Spinoza's God. And that marveling at this is not weakness or superstition. It is the most rational possible response to the scale of what exists. If you arrived without knowing exactly what you believe, if you are the type of person who is haunted by the question but has never found a language honest enough to hold it, Spinoza offers you this, a language, a method, a way of thinking about the most important things without lying to yourself. There's something Einstein said in a 1930 interview. This is perhaps the best summary of everything we've tried to do here. He said that the deepest experience a human being can have is not certainty, not faith, not the comfort of an answer that solves everything. It's what he called cosmic humility, the realization, which comes when you truly think about the scale of the universe and your place in it, that you are simultaneously infinitely small and infinitely part of something limitless. It's not an experience of annihilation. It's an experience of belonging. You are not a lost stranger in an indifferent universe. It's the universe perceiving itself through you, for now, in this configuration, at this moment. And that, as Spinoza said, as Einstein said, as those who have reached the end and looked honestly say, that is enough, more than enough. It is everything.